Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Chinese Medicine Integral Collective. I'm going to provide a little context. The topic for tonight is forgiveness, and Alexander will expand upon that. And then, as usual, we'll go for it. And we're happy to have everyone together, and we're happy to have all the listeners here joining us. And I thought in creating some context tonight, I'd just make a distinction between thought, contemplation, and meditation. So most of the kinds of discussions that people have about just about anything are based on thought. And thought really is a sort of concrete, this is what I know, this is what I believe in, this is what I'm sure of, this is what I don't believe in. It's usually deeply rooted in the past, building the past into the present. And it often involves a form of analysis where we just make two columns. You know, do I want the Volvo or do I want the Kia? And this is the color the Volvo comes in, and this is the price of both, and these are the warranties, and this is what they cost, and this is the mileage I might get, and weigh everything out. And I think I'll go with that one. Should I get divorced? Should I stay married? Should I have a kid? Should I have another kid? Column A, column B, kind of weigh everything out analytically. And most conversations are like this. We're a collective like this. 6 people will get together and everyone will say, this is what I think about forgiveness. And this is what my teacher said about forgiveness. And this is what I know about it. And so, you know, that's really thought. Thought is really the mind orienting us in time and space as a separate self. It can be, we can think of it that way. And I'd like to make the distinction with contemplation and meditation. Meditation is the renunciation of thought, feeling, emotion, and sensation, letting it all be. Meditation is the contemplation of nothing. In meditation, we open ourselves and we contemplate emptiness. We contemplate absence. We contemplate nothing. Contemplation, rather, is the meditation on something. So as opposed to thought, when I contemplate, so in preparing for this, every time I don't think to myself, what's everything I know about forgiveness? And let me look up the definition of forgiveness and see what different philosophers have said about forgiveness. What I do is I just create an empty space and I put out the intention that I'm open to learning about and receiving information about and getting a download on forgiveness. And I just create an opening and just allow what comes to come. And this is really a place that I learned to write books from, and I've learned to lecture from, and try to get to a point where I can play music from there, is just to set an intention and then just to see what comes and really be a vehicle for it. Often when I would write, I would get confused and I couldn't sort things out and think things out. And I learned, go for a bike ride, go for a walk, play some guitar, just drop it. And I'd be out on top of a mountain, and 15 minutes later, the whole solution would present itself to me from the unconscious so there's just a deep trust in contemplation, in receiving, and in creating an openness and providing an invitation to the soul, an invitation to the unconsciousness, an invitation to the void to just present, what do I need to know? What can I know about this? What is new? What is different? And this form of communication is very much a collective contemplation. We're not coming here to try to impress with what we know about forgiveness, to win others over to our way of seeing things. We're really creating an empty space together and asking together, what is forgiveness? What's my experience of it? And not just my historical experience, although that may play in, but right here, right now, what comes to me? And my experience is in creating an openness like that, other people talk, and then responses arise in me and images arise. And as someone's talking, information comes, and I'm not thinking about any of this. It's just coming and I'm letting it go, and it's coming and I'm letting it go. And then all of a sudden there's a, yeah, this sounds right. This sounds right. This sounds important. This sounds like it really builds upon what the last person says. So I tend to think of these dialogues as a group contemplation in real time of our experience of whatever it is we're going into, in the spirit of being willing to learn and give birth to something new. And these are successful when I think we all come out of it feeling like, I knew something about forgiveness coming into this from my life experience, but now it's more four-dimensional. Now it's more alive. Now I'm seeing it holistically from more angles than I ever could have on my own. So having laid a little ground there, turn it over to Alexander.
Thanks, Lonny. Welcome, everybody. So, about 27 years ago, my father was murdered. And about 2 or 3 months ago, I had the opportunity to meet the man who did it. And I think this is why Lonny asked me to open this, because when I stepped into that meeting with Herbert, there was nothing to forgive by that point. And so then the question arises, what can we do to arrive at a place where we have forgiven, where we're able to meet another heart without demanding that the past is between us? And this reminds me of Ying Qi, which gives some sort of implication of an encampment, a safe space where there's fire, there's warmth, so that we might construct something, to co-construct something. And we create blood, we create meaning, we create something that's nutritive. But this meaning-rich blood, we also know that it has a relationship to our memory, the ways in which we've received impressions from the world. And sometimes those impressions feel injurious, where we feel harmed by an action or actions of another. And in Chinese medicine, we might talk about this as the congealing of blood, where the receiving of that sensation of harm was so great that we couldn't keep our awareness in it. We had to pull the awareness out so that there could be a numbing. And inside this blood clot, this blood stagnation, we hold our own pain, but we also hold our perspective and assumptions and narratives around what this thing means, And there's a way in which that we capture history and we freeze it. But we're not just freezing the raw experience, we're freezing what nutritive threads of meaning we have created around it. This was terrible. This was horrible. That's a bad person. I'm a bad person, whatever it is. And then we take that blood clot and we put it in front of us. So now it's between us and the world. It's between us and the aggressor. And my sense of this is then this cuts us off from intimacy. It cuts us off from immediacy. Because now when I'm with the other person who I believe has done me harm, I can't see them. I can only see through the glasses of qi and blood stagnation, where my movements are constrained and my meaning making is constrained. and I can't see them. And so then my invitation here is, for us to explore, well, what can we do to soften that history that we've put in between us, so that somehow that can flow again, and then we can encounter the other who we believe has injured us. And we can sit down and we can look at them without that occluding what's happening right now, which then allows something like sitting down with a man named Herbert and not seeing a murderer, but seeing a human being with enough room for curiosity to see this man as a human being who's grown just as I have over the last 27 years. And then it's like our history, which is always pouring into the present moment, our history becomes the seeds of possibility. Instead of blood clots that are obscuring intimacy and the immediacy of becoming together, they become these seeds where we can tend. It still happened. He still murdered my father. But when there's seeds that we can tend, then now there's a possibility. So I'll leave it there as just an invitation for some symbols and imagery and textures of our medicine that might start to inform how we flow here with this question of what is forgiveness and how do we find it? How do we discover it? How do we cultivate it?
Well, you're having done that, Alexander, leading by example. And I mean, it's just a deeply inspirational, very beautiful thing. And I think it really pushes an edge in what humans are capable of in terms of almost in the present changing the past through showing that the past isn't concretized. And if you can do this with Herbert, then I know in my heart and in my deepest heart that the deepest conflicts on the planet can be solved in the same way, just by dropping the past for a little Chinese medicine and philosophical context. The Tao Te Ching tells us to repay injury with original nature, with virtue. And that when something like this and a wrong like this is committed in the world, there's really no human solution in terms of justice, which doesn't mean that justice doesn't have to be enacted in some way. But it means that things can only be said to be restored when the event that happened isn't in the way of both parties really fulfilling their path, fulfilling their destiny and their life curriculum. And, you gave a little background of this, and you've been talking to me about this. It's not just something that happened 3 months ago. You were in a process for a long time to get to the point where you had that conversation. And it really is something to be able to reach into that dimension of human relationship beyond the shouldn'ts, rights, wrongs, and the harm, back to the source of self, which is unwounded, untouched, and optimistic and just interested in what's possible. and finding out what's possible. And I just think that I found your example to be deeply inspirational to myself as a wood constitutional type. I mean, there were long sections of my own life where I just thought some things are just unforgivable. There are just some things that are unforgivable. And I've really softened that in my own self and realized, I mean, it's just my experience that to be free is significantly in some ways based on forgiveness and not carrying the past in a way that's harming me or harming somebody else. Which doesn't mean not, being naive, but I think in my own experience, as we become souls and not just egos, but souls, and take a deep time perspective, I've seen that I've played all roles. And just in this lifetime, I've been abused, I've been an abuser. I've been lied to and I've lied, and I've been abandoned and I've abandoned people. And I think at least I've come to a point where I would want forgiveness for anything I've done when I was more ignorant than I am now. And certainly then need to extend that to everything and everyone.
I was going to say, forgiveness is a little bit like rolling back the stone that's blocking the tomb that we might have put ourselves into. And it's a very freeing act, not just for the other, but also for ourselves. And I think contextualizing it in terms of Chinese medicine makes a lot of sense in terms of blood and qi stagnation. It obviously allows flow to occur and an opening of the heart and a fulfilling of the heart's destiny when one is able to forgive and free oneself. And it just changes the dynamics. If there's somebody else involved, it changes the dynamics between the two. And as Alexander said, it plants the seeds of possibility. And when one doesn't forgive oneself, there's a lot of stagnation that is occurring in the body, in the terrain of our body that could be stuck. I'm thinking of patients who don't forgive themselves for not trying to have a baby earlier in life or putting their careers first or something like that. And when, as a practitioner, you're able to help them move qi and blood or recognize something or be seen and heard, miracles happen. It's a very potent thing, forgiveness. And it could be at so many different levels. There could be so many things that are obvious that might come up for discussion for forgiveness, but there are also hidden things that are not revealed, that are within ourselves that we don't even know that we haven't forgiven ourselves for, that are just binding up potency. It's gonna leave it like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking about self-forgiveness as well. And not just in terms of the conscious ways that I might harbor guilt or feelings about things in my past where I may not have forgiven myself consciously, but some of the ways that I have been conditioned by society to go against myself and to become inauthentic and to try to be a person in the world that does these things. That needs to be forgiven too. And I see forgiveness as like this solvent that brings it all back to love. And that love is almost too tender and too exquisite because it's so undefended to live from that place. Because as soon as there's forgiveness needed, there's some sense of wrongdoing. Somebody has wronged me, I have wronged somebody, I have wronged myself, I have gone against myself. So there's a judgment that precedes the need to forgive. And so if I forgive, I encounter the judgment, and beneath the judgment, I encounter something that is beyond judgment, that's beyond anything. And it's so tender and so loving and so delicate and so precious that it's much easier to find wrongdoing that then I can forgive. It keeps it superficial. Because as soon as I'm in that motion, I have to, here's the wrong thing that then good old me is going to take care of. But when I started thinking about forgiveness, it went so deep that I don't even know what to say about it. It feels too tender and too sweet. And I'm just kind of left like, I don't even know what forgiveness is, because it doesn't feel like it comes from me. It feels like there's a universal power that envelops the depth of the heart and takes it in. And I almost can't handle that amount of love.
That's certainly my experience, Randine, that whatever it was that allowed me, it took about 6 months from reaching out to an organization to meeting with Herbert. And it was very clear to me that being able to do that was, and to be able to do that where love was the front and center of what was happening, felt like and feels like, I'm speaking in the past, but I'm with the quality here now, a kind of love that is from beyond the human. It doesn't feel like it's something that I am creating or that I have in my heart, that I have coming from like something that I'm doing, but it's more like what I hear you speaking into, of it's more of broadening the vessel to be able to see how much of this can we, I don't even think contain is the right word. How do we become obliterated sufficiently that this love can anchor through and show the world what's possible when we allow that to be the thing that's taking us through, taking us forward, taking us into relationships where we can look at someone like Herbert and, see that he's good and tell him right there, I see your goodness. That, I mean, for me, I don't know that that's something like, I don't know. I mean, maybe we say that's human. Maybe that's human nature, because humans have the capacity to be overwhelmed in a positive way by this big love. Like, I don't know. But I don't know. It feels as if it comes from a beyond.
But I think that is our ultimate human nature.
Right.
When we know that, when we live from that beyond, then we're truly human.
Yeah, that feels right.
Yeah, that groundless space of being, where it just folds into that exquisitely tender spot that you speak of, Randine. Alexander, I can't even imagine the profound crossroads that you engaged. It's really important, and I'm grateful that we share this experience in this conversation. And when I bring it back up to, because Randine, after you place the groundless place of being under this whole conversation, where do we go? We can only return to the play, and that play is, I suppose, how do I sign causality in some experience where does causality actually exist in the play of relationship? Is the other an expression of some unresolved state in self, and merely acting out that which is yet to become integral within myself because of a lack of capacity or denial or fear of a shadow content? That possibility calls upon me to forgive myself initially before I can forgive the other. And Vansanthi, as you said, at the level of the heart, this is the place, and it engages some level of, I suppose, into the metaphors of cosmic water and fire as they're engaged at the level of the triple burner and the pericardium. These are the axes along which these manifestations take place, right? In the pericardium, the inner world, I am the healing and the presence and the love and the graciousness that is creating the possibility of some transformation inside myself relative to who I am and what I've done and what I haven't done. And that fold of the engagement, which makes it possible for another to do something which I can identify as transgression taking place at the cause of another, which merely becomes a projection of my own psyche, ultimately, my own experience, my own. And so having a body makes it a necessity that some experience unfolds, which is needing that resolution of for that which is before the form, the shadow in Plato's cave, that which is before and cast upon the world, and I can't separate myself from that upon which I've projected. Other than to collapse into that exquisite place that you unveiled, Randine.
So that feeling that there's a force that's coming from beyond, I think alludes to the fact that we are more than we think we are, in the sense that we're all interconnected to the whole cosmos. And when our limited stories and narratives are patterns that have, when we have an awareness of it, and they, when we dissolve them, somehow that force, we're no longer just this body and containing that story and that narrative, and somehow I feel like it allows a force to come through us, which we are connected to, but not necessarily aware of. um, I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but that feeling that it's coming from somewhere else, that there's another force involved. It's all there available the minute we get over the limitations of the narrative start patterns in our bodies.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I experience that force as the life force, and I experience it as myself. And if I'm holding on to some past view, some concretized view of history, then chi is just not flowing. And I'm not really breathing. I'm not really in sync with the breath of the coming and going of things. And just that, as everybody's talking, I was just thinking about the relationship of metal to wood, and metal just constraining wood, and wood holding on, not being able to move past some injustice or some vision of what was done wrong, and the metal just letting go with breath so that wood can flourish and support the heart and the opening of the heart. I just got a deep sense of forgiveness having a lot to do with that relationship, maybe between colon and liver, and just the letting go of history into the abyss so that I can just breathe and the wood can grow and things can flow, and that life force, then that Jung-chi just makes me want to sit up straight, and that is like the rectification of virtue, of original nature, the presence of well, just the realization that the past is the past, but where do we want to go now? In a way that's unconstrained, in a way that's a completely new possibility.
Well, it's like I think that my sense as you're speaking is that when something happens, when we feel that we've been hurt or victimized or injured, when that constraint occurs, there's also a closing of our world, of what we see in the world. You know, you did this to me. You know, that group did this to our group. And one of the things that occurs to me as you're speaking is that as that metal lets go and starts to free up the wood, I mean, wood grows up, but the blood of the wood, it's it's interested in embracing all perspectives. It may not agree with them or use them or go with them, but it'll embrace all these perspectives, which inform the sort of emergence of the growing towards the sun. And, you know, to bring that into my experience with Herbert, you know, I knew that he had a hard life. I could just guess. But then in meeting him and hearing his life and hearing that, you know, he saw his first person killed in front of him before he was a teenager. And on and on. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the point is as that metal lets go and as the wood is able to broaden, not just shoot up, but broaden its gaze, all of a sudden you start to see collectives interfacing with other collectives and start to see, well, how is it that someone like Herbert grows up in a neighborhood where that we as a group of human beings have allowed such a neighborhood to exist, where there's such trauma that is unaddressed and uncared for. It's almost like there's just like forgotten people that have endured the presence of all kinds of things that we have participated in creating. And then all of a sudden, you know, at some point it occurred to me that this culture, this larger culture that we have created together, produces environments where a good child at their essence is hurt and so repetitively that killing someone is just not, it's not understood as a bad idea. So it's not like Herbert's the villain. What I, discovered as the widening of the wood and the broadening of the vision, that we're all responsible for this. We're all responsible for this. And then it takes us out of this narrative of the hero and the villain that we're constantly sort of being shown. It's so much more complicated and nuanced, and nobody is outside of responsibility for any of it, because we're all the whole thing. We're co-creating it.
Along those lines of the metal and wood is oftentimes, constructed as self and other, that lateral plane of engagement. And then I like how Mikio Sanke puts the esoteric Shaoyin, that Jing Shen component of self, the integral self of the fire of consciousness within the water, the pools of the Jing in our ancestry. And how do we come to the place of not just forgiving ourselves, but forgiving those ancestors before us who brought us to this place, because we are the embodiment of that work. And then unfolding from there the engagements of how that vision unfolds into the arena of exchange, such that the possibility exists that I could take something personally. It's not about me, and it never was. Contrarily, it's all about me. In my narcissistic exhortations, it is nothing but me.
I feel that there's so much, and I've been really taking in so many pieces of this conversation. But Will, I think what you're pointing to there, the paradox between it being all about me and it having nothing to do, well, it being not about me. Let me say that in that way. And as I'm listening, I mean, a few words keep really standing out. I think, Alexander, you beginning with this idea that before the need to forgive comes the coagulation of the blood. So even though we're speaking to this question of forgiveness, I think we can't really speak about forgiveness without remembering its opposite. And that opposite, the coagulating of the blood, the accumulation or stagnation in the Gaohuang around the pericardium, these are real situations that we see. I mean, how many sessions, have we all had with, the wronged partner in a marriage as it's ending? And I mean, I myself, having gone through a really, really difficult breakup of a marriage, and the incredible kind of feuding and vitriol and hanging on to. But to say, what does it take? I mean, I'm kind of listening to, I think, I don't remember if it was you, Vansanthi, or Randine, you spoke to that, the dissolving of that coagulation. And I think, Alexander, it's I really appreciate, you know, you're saying this takes time. It's not that dissolving or dissolution of the coagulation that happens when I feel wronged. Like I think of the word blood feud, you know, it's like the blood feud that just, you know, resists that dissolving. It's very, very deep. And what I'm feeling as I'm listening is that there is a little bit, and I don't want to get too deep into the structures of consciousness and the mental moving into the integral, but there's something about the feud or the mentis, the anger, that has something to do with a way that a self begins to form around the coagulation, you know, around the stagnation, around the I was wronged here. That moving from that to forgiveness, there's something about that process, I think, both personally, but also as a practitioner. How do we hold that movement that does, at least in my mind, have something to do with a temporal experience, like the soul in a body that takes some time. And I think, as I'm thinking about my own process of coming to forgiveness, real forgiveness of my daughter's father, who I now can look at and my heart just opens and I'm just like, you're so wonderful. This person that I literally was like, give me the mafia, you know, I am like the woman with the sword, you know, and now it's like, oh, you know, what a beautiful human that you are. And what happens in there? You know, what is that movement? And I hear this, yes, there's a flow to the wood as the wood begins to let go and give over and the blood flows into, you know, the heart. But I'm really interested in how that metal grips on and what happens in terms of identity formation that we have to honor or at least recognize as part of this process. You know, of course, I go to, this could be a distortion of the metal or distortion of the pose soul in its thinking it's going to survive this way. Like I'm going to survive through this not forgiving. And then, as everyone's saying, that moving into forgiveness is a kind of letting go into something bigger than my ego identity. But I'm curious about that process, like what happens in there and what's the gift of the process? How do we bring that into the treatment room? I mean, Alexander, you've spoken to your own experience. I can speak to mine. I mean, but there is something there of value, of necessity, I think, for us as humans. Otherwise, why would people be getting into this for, you know, ever since the Greeks, you know, ever since forever, people have been looking at how do I move past this revenge or move past holding on to guilt or wrongdoing. There's something.
I love this idea of the metal forming an identity around it. Because now I've created this dualistic dynamic where I am the beloved victim of this story here. And the perpetrator out there gives me a sense of like justification for my wound, for my trauma, for every excuse that I have in my life, for everything I've ever done because of my wound. And it keeps this dualistic perspective going that I'm the wounded one because of this trauma. And I think that there's something about, you know, merging with it, that merging, that when we were talking earlier, or when Lonnie, you were first talking about the wood and the metal, I was thinking about the fire in the wood.
Mm, mm,
And that penetration, I was thinking more Jue Yin, that penetration, that there's the fire in the wood that has to intimately burn away the residue of the story of my own victimization, my own wrongdoing. And that's what leads to that vulnerability, because then I don't get that identity as the wounded one, or the one that has this nice little narrative that's been perpetuated.
But you know, Randy, now you're saying it. This is like what's so beautiful. I'm just gonna, is it's also how that fire touches the metal, because that's the thing. It's when we're seen to the level. I think of the myth of Inanna, and this is Sumerian. This is 4,000 years ago, and this dark goddess, Ereshkigal, is puts her on a meat hook, like she's hanging her down in the underworld. And Ereshkigal is moaning, and it's like, I'm in such pain. I'm in such horrendous pain. I'm going to do this to my sister and hang her on the meat hook and just go on and on. And the thing that shifts it in the myth are these little tiny creatures who fly down, and they're able to see Ereshkigal's pain. It's like, oh, because she's like a monster. She's this writhing monster on the floor of the underworld, right? I mean, that's us too. Like I know, we parts of us have been there, and it's that she's seen by these little creatures, and they say, "Oh, your pain, your suffering." And through that seeing, and I feel like that's the warmth of the fire, when we can bring that kind of compassion. I mean, Alexander, you brought it to Herbert, but first you had to bring it where somehow it had to be brought, that what you suffered was seen, what you lost.
Yeah, and I love that you brought that, because I think, we can talk about metal as this like identity, and this like, I have this vision of being a victim, and that's all true. But what I feel like you're speaking to is, I mean, it reminds me of my aunt, who's 7 years older than my dad, and was handed to her as a newborn, saying, this is basically, treat this young baby like your own child. And so, yes, there's the identity around being a victim, but what I feel like you're pointing to is the recognition of the crushing nature. It where the metal is making it so that it's very difficult to feel the fire because of such agony, because of such agony. And yes, there's identity in that, but there's also an incredible sense of being crushed so fully that the heart is no longer felt, and it's, the burden is so much that it weighs so heavy, and it reminds me of a character for compassion that shows the heart, and then above it it shows the silk, these two silk with vegetation, and it has this quality of like velvet, like a velvet love is how I like to interpret it. When you look at the sort of earlier images for silk, they're like these little cocoons. And as I connect with that, the way I like to dream, or the dream that kind of arises in me around it, is these kind of these cocoons, these alchemical cocoons, where we are able to like embrace an unspeakable, that's why I loved you talked about the meat hook. It's like the unspeakable, the unutterable degrees of pain that can be felt by a human heart can be held in these little chrysalis cocooning, but it's made from this beyond human love, right? It's like silk. It's like the fresh, newly born grasses that are soft, and that there's some sort of an alchemical fire in that compassionate embrace that can have some way of liberating a pain that I don't know on our own. And I think that that's maybe partly the point. On our own, it crushes us. And so then there is a bow. And if whatever it is that brings grace, if in that bow, there's somehow the contact with what's bigger that carries us, then that compassion starts to liberate that suffering. And then I think metal can breathe again. And the heart is now able to take residency, primary residency again, as the kind of vessel through which that beyond human love is lusciously pouring through.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's beyond human though, because I mean we are that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're just feeling into what it means to be human in deeper and deeper and higher and wider dimensions of the self. And I think this speaks very deeply to just a bodhisattvic orientation to life, that whatever comes, my commitment is to work with that and transform the lead into gold. And I'm really interested in this issue that's come up a few times around identity and temporality and time, because the Alexander that met with Herbert 3 months ago is not the Alexander whose father was killed, and Herbert is not the guy who did it. The Herbert you met with 3 months ago is not the person who did it. And it's been my experience in the course of my own life that the hardest forgiveness I've had to arrive at, and around some of the deepest wounding around, having to do, for instance, with family members, or, specifically with my own father, who's 90 now, and, has a touch of dementia. And I just realized the person I was terrified of and the person I had neither of those two people exist anymore. They exist as depths in the archaeology of a self that I can regress to and see through those eyes. But I can't do that exclusively, because there's just so much more life experience and so much more understanding. And the self I was when these things happened at 4 or 8 or 10 or 12 or 20, with him or with anyone, it doesn't really exist anymore, except as an echo. A faint echo, a fade. It's sort of like the picture I have on my fridge of my family riding a roller coaster when my kids were little, that the amusement park took with a Polaroid, and now there's the faintest image and it's almost all white. So
That's funny.
so there's that kind of, so it's sort of like that, and realizing that there really is nothing to hold on to. And And then what takes the place of whatever I was holding on to actually is gratitude for having a body and having a heart and having the opportunity of whatever days I have left to give.
Mm.
And,
yeah.
yeah.
When you say that, Lon, it just really brings about that possibility that there's actually nothing to forgive. I also felt that with both of my parents. Certainly as a child, I had moments where it was like, this is the worst. There's nothing that could be possibly worse than this, whatever it is. I'm not going to go to details, but I mean, I remember being with both of my parents at their deathbeds, caring for them, and actually having nothing to forgive, no conversations about forgiveness, but only the question of presence, the presence of love. And that was it. So then that concept of identification becomes a kind of edifice or an ensconcement that we hold that actually doesn't exist. I mean, it does exist. It can only exist as much as we create it, hold it, and maintain it. But that was, but you brought me to that experience I had with both of my parents, where there was I felt really nothing to forgive. It wasn't that I didn't want to forgive, it was just not there.
So sometimes there's a binding between you and the person that you're trying to forgive, and energetically, without the involvement of the mind, these barriers can be removed. Maybe I'm digressing a little bit, but I'm just going to go back to what Lorie said about having a bad divorce. And I think I was also someone who went through a bad divorce. And suddenly one day someone shows up and energetically severs the cords between me and my ex-husband through 7 layers of energy in 4 directions, maybe a 15-minute process. And she repeated something about severing the ties between me and him and pouring it into the river of forgiveness, taking it back to the sun and letting it shine for the good of all. And it was just a brief thing. And I can't explain, but it totally freed me. I didn't know what to make of it on the day, but I realized that it was very significant. So it was nothing intellectual or nothing, it was just something that freed me up. It was a cutting that freed me up. It happened to be Good Friday that day, and the sun was shining, and it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But it just dissolved everything. It sounds rather miraculous, but from that day onwards, I didn't have this angst anymore. I just felt totally free. Going back to what Will was saying about, parents dying, I lost my mother maybe 4 months ago. And I felt the same way about both my parents on their deathbed. There was nothing to forgive, just love and gratitude for the life that they had given me. The other thing I wanted to say about the myth that Lorie talked about being seen, she was seen by these creatures. So that's also to me a little bit of a seeing and hearing, to me a little bit about the Taiyang attributes that contribute to that Shaolin axis and allows it to remain integrated. So when you see and hear your patient, I feel that the seeing, is like bladder point, bladder 1 maybe, and hearing it, we could just take the example of small intestine 19, listening paths. Both of them touch the heart very deeply, the inner canthus being the reflective area of the heart. And the potency of that to dissolve what binds the heart is tremendous. Everybody wants to be seen and heard. That was very much a Dr. Hammer thing. And maybe the reason that we want to entomb ourselves or embody that it's really ultimately all fear-based. It's our desperate human need to survive, and it's predicated on that human babies can't survive when they're born on their own. And so we've all, from day one, found ways of surviving. And it's easy to fall back on those patterns. And only really through awareness can we transcend them.
Yeah, I'm struck by how we get stuck in archetypes of the wounded, and the other person becomes the wounder, or the betrayed and the betrayer, and how much the core of the ego as a separate self sense is really solidified around these notions, and how, as Randine and pointed to, and there really is, that is all such a surface level discussion. And I think we all have the experience that many patients come in and they're in an existential knot, and everything's a problem. All they can see is problem, and they're so identified with that wound and that trauma. And I would never say it isn't real, but whatever degree it is real is a kind of finitude sitting in an infinite ocean of a self that's so much bigger and where there's so much more possibility. And in that dimension of the self, there's just no inherent limitation. And without, and in the process that Alexandra's been going through, which again is so inspiring, I very much get the sense of a willingness to let go of any inherent sense of limitation based on past experience, or even the present experience of past wound. And in my own life, my experience is everything has been surrendered and let go of at the moment, where the thing that becomes most interesting to me is what's possible and not what has been. So at least to a degree of like 51%. So not to deny what has been, but there's a 2% shift from where like the past has been the most important thing to that imminent potential just at the absolute edges, coming in, that incipient potential of what's possible, and having all my attention just make that 1 degree shift off of what has been to what can be. And in that, there's this opening up and this birth of this, this infinite love. And I think the love is too much for a heart to hold unless that heart is really broken open.
Yes.
And then when it's really broken open, then we just merge with it. We just are it.
My experience, I'm recalling James Baldwin saying that the history isn't the past, the history is the present. And I love it because I feel like he's making a distinction between what happened and how history lives in us,
Yeah.
and that those are two really different things. It sort of connects to when Lonnie was talking about how, you know, the Alexander that experienced this happen and the Herbert who did this are not the two people that we're meeting per se. And yet those two people exist in some way as living history. And I think that, you know, there's something about what does it mean to let go of the past, to allow the past to be something that has ended, but how to embrace history as it's alive. And as I've been writing this book that I've been writing and working these stories, going into the funeral moments. And there was a time when my father was killed in my aunt's, his office was in her basement of her house, her sort of bottom floor. And there was a moment where I went there after and went into the room where it happened. But as I'm writing these stories, I'm not going into the past. I'm entering into the history and how it's living in me, and then it's changing. The history is changing because I can go there with the current Alexander and I can notice more of what's on the walls and the quality in the space and the fragrance of what can emerge. And it's like the colors that were more dull then are now stronger now because the history is mixing with the present moment's access to these things we've been describing of deep nature, of these currents of love, of the radiance and aliveness and potency of how life is bursting through things. And so then there's a way that it's history then transforms. The funeral that I attended now, through writing these stories about it, this is a mind-blowing funeral. There's all sorts of amazing things happening, music pouring from the walls and angels and knees turning into sand. And I mean, it's a living experience that can take shape and change. And somehow there's a way in which for me, it's one way that those clots disintegrate so that they can integrate as something new, as art, as color, as life, as something that's no longer numb and no longer in the way of something.
I really appreciate how you're speaking to this, Alexander, and I think it's getting at the thing I'm trying to get at, which is that I think what we're grappling with here is the nature of consciousness itself, and this idea that if we are, as you say, Lonnie, if we're at this choice point, right, every moment, as to where we want to locate ourselves. Do we want to locate ourselves in the limited ego identity? Or do we want to locate or dislocate into this much vaster possibility, which is always available to us? And I feel like that's something that you, Lonnie, brings into the space in your speaking. But I feel like where I got a little stuck was in to say, well, the Alexander who lost his father, that this doesn't no longer exists. I feel like where I'm taking that is more, again, in a sort of Gebzerian idea of diaphaneity. It's that, and the image that comes to me is the rings of the tree. The rings of the tree don't disappear over time, but they become part of a larger and larger design. And so in what we're speaking to, this capacity to move beyond, being arrested in the past, but rather keeping that history alive as present and alive as an ongoing growing of the limited self into the unlimited self, I still feel that part of that process requires this interception of compassion, or an interception of a kind of relational seeing, whether it's of another person, as practitioners in the treatment room, can we see both the small circle of the self and the unlimited self at the same time? It feels like that's a piece of how that process can happen, or really bringing it to, how do I do this in the treatment room? How do I do this with a person who's coming in ranting about the wrongdoing that's been done to them? I have to hold both that limited self and the unlimited self at the same time, not to eradicate or to say, well, one doesn't exist, but it exists within this much larger possibility. And sometimes there's a process there. Sometimes there's a time component that has to unfold, a story that needs to be seen and spoken, and then retold, as you're saying, Alexander, retold. Yeah.
And rewoven. And I think about like Vasanthi's experience with the cutting of the energetic cords, like some sort of ritual enacted in the moment that is an honoring of the wound and the brokenness and the lack of forgiveness. And like there's something that has to alchemize it, that acknowledges it, that says, I was here, this was here, this wound was here. It's not something that just went away by itself. That can happen too. But the way, in the most artful and creative ways possible, that we can ritually enact a new way to relate, to alchemize the pain into something beautiful, so that the funeral comes alive. And when I listen to Alexander speak of this tragedy of his life, it opens my heart so much. I'm in such gratitude that it happened, not that you had to go through that pain, or that your aunt had to go through that pain, but look what's coming of it. Like, look what the most broken of human beings has to contribute to the expansion of our one soul, and the ability to touch one another from that ritualistic enactment of this messy, difficult, beautiful, exquisite life that we all get to live, and be wounded and feel like we need to forgive. And then we reach that place, like Will spoke of that radical forgiveness. There's nothing to forgive. It's all part of this beautiful play.
Part of that, Randine, is, as I'm listening to everyone speak just now, is that I just forgot. I forgave and forgot, and that was a different thing, to that adage of time heals all wounds, and it's actually kind of true. And if we let it, that's the salve of time, care for our wounds. That harsh, stern form of Kronos or Saturn just also needs love. And I was reminded, when it comes to the ritual pieces, I had a client come to me and wanted me to perform ritual severance of a dybbuk. And dybbuk is, of course, a bloodline affliction within the Hebrew tradition. And and her Rebbe wouldn't do it, and so she asked me to do it, and so I did the work using different methods that I've been taught over the years in different cultures, a transcultural kind of a thing, and it worked. She was better, and she was better for years, but it came back. And she then went to and these are serious afflictions of paternal incest and other matters going way back through the bloodline. And she went to an Irish Rebbe in Los Angeles, and he said, "This is a Dybbuk. It's your bloodline. You can't get rid of it. It's part of you. You must transform your relationship with this inside yourself." And she did. And she's been freed ever since. It was rather profound and a tremendous lesson to me.
That's an incredible story, Will. And I love that story because I think in a certain way, right? Isn't
Yeah.
that what we're really talking about all along?
Yeah.
You know, it's transforming that internal relationship to our conception of what happened. But I love the realness of this, how they spoke to it. And I particularly also, Randine, appreciate and Vansanthi, you know, we're all also the relationship of ritual to this process, like the ritual in the sense of bringing this spiritual experience into some kind of physical form. I mean, you did it, Alexander, by going to the prison. I mean, you had done so much before that, but to me, the meeting with Herbert, you can't get like a bigger ritual than that. I mean, I can hardly imagine. As I said to you, you know, what an incredible.
I mean, I think that comes back to your question, like what are, because ritual, we can use the word ritual, we can also use the word practice, you know, what are the practices how do we do this? What kind of inner disposition do we have to cultivate to be able to contact a kind of love that can transmute hatred or crushing grief or any number of things?
Or Dybbuk's.
Exactly. Where we look at our lineage as a individual sort of lineage, or we look at our lineage as humanity and can look out that as a collective, we've torn each other apart and experienced incredible ecstasy and everything, you know, boredom, you know, a whole litany of things we've created together. And we're all sort of being born with the entire history of the cosmos, you know, arising here. And so what do we do to have the courage to get curious about that? To really to turn north, right? You know, we have this notion of yin is turning north, sort of turning inward, and yang is south facing. And what what kind of what's required for us to turn in the direction of north? To look inside and just for a minute, just pause pause the movie and say, wait a minute, maybe it's not the way I thought it was. Maybe a villain didn't steal my life or whatever we think. And to just go inside long enough to sit there and see what happens if we don't think our way around everything. And then as a part of ritual, pray, help, you know, what's the, you know, what, if we're speaking from from the perspective of the contracted self that doesn't know their way out of forgiveness, doesn't know their way out into a place of forgiveness. I mean, we've been crying out for help as long as we've had a voice. And calling and responding, man, this is how music happens. It's how it's learned. It's how it's played. It's how we get milk on the very first day. And there's a humility but it's not a humility like a cultivated humility. It's a humility of like weakness that maybe brings in a flash of grace, and then a little doorway opens, and then that seed of something beautiful starts to build. And then we see that we weren't the thing we thought we were, and we no longer have to cry out, but yet there's still those places in us that cry out. But we are the nectar, feeding feeding the one that's crying out. And then we know as everything is okay, even in its, days of horror and days of ecstasy.
Yeah, you literally said, used the exact words that were coming to me, which is that forgiveness is a grace. And in that grace, there's a humility, which allows for the potential to change, to transform, to become the kind of, that forgiveness as grace unlocks the key to transformation in all parties, on both sides of the equation, simultaneously. And that is the expression of that diaphanous source as as eros, as love.
That that happened with Leon and I, and it was the moment where I just took responsibility for everything that happened between us, and I said, Leon, I'm sorry.
I'm laughing because that's how my relationship with him was rectified too. I took him to dinner and said, Leon, it was all my fault. So I'm laughing because I never heard you say that before, but
That's how it happened with my ex-husband too. Total responsibility.
Me too.
It was the best. I was totally liberated.
when I did it, Leon didn't know what to say.
Well, neither did my ex-husband.
He was dumbfounded, but it created an opening.
Created an opening. He said, I wish I could have been the guy who said that. Go, me too. No, I didn't say that. But
I think we're at. We've made it to 9 o'clock. If you want to finish the thought, Will, do you want to close it out?
Oh, sure. I think in summary, it comes back to that numinous place that we began this whole series with, and that in that numinous place is the love, and in that place where, as Randine characterized it, as radical forgiveness is a place where there is no forgiveness to be given. That absolute emptiness, which you were referencing, Lonnie, at the beginning of this whole conversation, is really where this whole conversation rests, and where the ultimate potency in this effort is realized.
Beautiful. Okay, I'm going to pause the recording.